The opening of Parliament in Lagos, Nigeria in 1960, with Princess Alexandra standing in for the Queen, marked the official launch of Africa's biggest democracy. Nigeria was now independent with its own parliament on the federal model. 100 years of colonial rule had come to an end. Those were exciting days, a profoundly liberating time in history, because the general attitude of white people to black people and of black to white now began to swing full circle, away from the old constricting racism of white superiority matched against black inferiority, and forward to a new acceptance of the attitude of the classical and medieval world that whites and blacks certainly are different from each other in their appearance as in their history, but in human terms just as certainly are equal with each other. Within a year, another 17 African countries became independent, and African statesmen and politicians began to take their proper place in the councils of the world. The ending of colonial rule was good for Africa. It brought new confidence, a sense of independent achievement, and many fresh opportunities.
Africans unite, unite so we can cross the rivers, unite so we can cross the desert, unite so we can climb the mountains, unite so we can crush apartheid. No matter the color of your eyes and your skin, remember we are one in the Lord. Remember we are one in the blood. Remember we are brothers in the world. Together we will solve our problems. Together we will save our countries. Together we will change the world.
A good deal of modern Africa is a big success story, bustling, elbowing, go-getting, full of vigor, and of course, full of the problems of rapid growth and change. But however difficult the problems were to become, the opportunity for Africans to build modern cities was one of the gains of independence. In a major African city like Lagos, vast sums have been invested in all the facilities of a 20th century capital. Lagos is a modern city running ahead of a much less developed countryside. Like many other cities, it's grown so fast as to be almost overwhelmed by the problems it has to bear. Problems of traffic and electric power and main drainage, problems of rising crime rates and overcrowded slums. The toughest of these problems were and are anything but new. They have their roots in a social and economic crisis, a profound crisis which began within the European colonial empires in Africa and as long ago as the Second World War. That was when vast numbers of country people began to flood into sprawling towns and cities, looking for escape, for refuge from village hunger, from forced labor, and from other miseries of those days. Nairobi, capital of Kenya, has built up the same business success as Lagos and suffers from the same troubles. In fact, most African cities have trebled or quadrupled in size over the last 20 years. and resources have been spent in the cities at the cost of much larger rural populations. People from the countryside have continued to flood into the city looking for work and squat in the inevitable shanty towns which form on every patch of land, even close to the city centre. Crowded and insanitary, these shanty towns are breeding places for disease and crime. And massive unemployment among those who live in them is unrelieved by the welfare state facilities of wealthier countries. This huge growth of cities has led to tensions and troubles which few African governments have been able to contain.
When independence came, European models of parliamentary government were adopted, but the European models have proved increasingly unworkable. This is not because Africans haven't known how to operate their own systems of representative or constitutional government, or even of democracy. On the contrary, their history has revealed a variety of such systems. The European models failed for other reasons. They were evolved, after all, within class-divided societies, very different in their structure from the societies of this continent. Here, as it happened, the parliamentary systems fell increasingly into the hands of small groups of privileged people who hastily sought their personal gain at the expense of the majority and soon were lost in confusion and corruption.
The temptation for political leaders to imitate the lifestyle of their former rulers has been almost irresistible, and European businessmen have been quick to exploit this weakness in Africa's new rulers and promote it to their own advantage. The gap in living standards between a few rich and many poor has grown dangerously wide, and the worst aspects of the colonial legacy have sometimes reappeared in grotesque shape. No one went so far down the road of privilege and corruption as General Bokassa of the Central African Republic. Having proclaimed himself president for life, Bokassa indulged an apparently insatiable appetite for pomp and ceremony, sometimes indeed to the envy or discomfort of neighboring rulers, some of whom had also taken dictatorial powers. In 1974, this one-time soldier in the French colonial forces, backed by business and political partners in Paris, promoted himself marshal of an army barely big enough to put on a parade. But there were plenty of policemen. Critics and opponents were tortured and killed. Bokassa's reign became a bloody caricature of the dictatorship of colonial times. In 1977, with the solemn connivance of his friends in France, Bokassa had himself crowned as emperor over an empire of scarcely 2 million desperately poor people. The coronation cost over a quarter of the country's income, and Bokassa wasn't the only would-be monarch.
They think king is something very big, so that they wanted to crown me as the king of Africa.
Field Marshal Amin, another ex-colonial soldier, seized power in Uganda to the great satisfaction of the British government. Like other African dictators, Amin stepped into a power gap opened by the failure of the political institutions derived from the colonial legacy.
I have been most popular in the Africa because other Africa, even if it is a superpower, makes a mistake, the heads of state are afraid of correcting or pointing out that mistake. Only me who can point out that mistake, and that the entire Africa said that this is the hero of Africa and this is the king of Africa.
Amin courted popularity in public while secretly imprisoning and torturing his opponents. Increasingly anxious to distract attention from the miseries he'd caused, Amin sent his army to attack neighboring Tanzania. Reluctantly, the Tanzanians hit back and went to the aid of Amin's opponents. This brief war was none of their choosing, but they embarked on it at great cost to themselves in the conviction that Africa must put its own house in order. Short of modern weapons, fuel and ammunition, the Tanzanians were still able to advance with speed, for they met little opposition. With obvious jubilation, Ugandans greeted the Tanzanian troops as liberators, and many rallied to fight alongside them. When the Tanzanians entered Amin's headquarters, the so-called State Research Bureau, the reasons for this rejoicing became plain. They uncovered gruesome evidence of torture, poisoning, the deliberate starving and shooting of thousands of political prisoners, many of whom were killed in the last hours before relief came from Tanzania. The wars which have diminished the gains of independence all have their origins in the colonial legacy and in the problems of building new nations. The longest war began in 1962 when Ethiopia annexed the former Italian colony of Eritrea. Emperor Haile Selassie, who'd carried through the annexation, was overthrown by a military coup in 1974. Popular revolution followed. But the new government failed to solve its fundamental political problem: how to transform Haile Selassie's empire into a freely accepted federation of its various peoples. So the war continued, with tens of thousands of Ethiopian conscripts still trying to put down the resistance of ill-armed but stubborn Eritrean volunteers. The military regime of Ethiopia, under its leader, Colonel Mengistu, stayed loyal to the old imperial ambitions, but the arms supplies no longer came from Britain and America. The Ethiopian government found new friends as rivalry between the superpowers spread destructively throughout Africa. Outsiders continued to meddle with Africa's affairs. Ethiopia sought the help of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. All across Africa, other wars were caused by the problem called tribalism. Many peoples found it hard to live together within the old colonial frontiers now that these had become national frontiers. The worst of these internal wars was fought in Nigeria, around the would-be breakaway Republic of Biafra. The loyalties of the Igbo people, including some pitifully young volunteers, were ruthlessly exploited by their leaders. The Oxford-educated Colonel Ojukwu, the Igbo leader, had the backing of foreign oil and business interests. With the help of sophisticated propaganda, he convinced his followers that they must fight or face genocide. This was the problem of tribalism at its worst.
We are Biafra, fighting for our nation. By the name of Jesus, we can conquer. Oh, we are Biafra, Ojukwu, fighting for our nation. By the name of Jesus, we must conquer. We are Biafra, fighting for our nation. By the name of Jesus, we can conquer. Oh, Biafra, oh, fighting for our nation, Ojukwu, in the name of Jesus, we shall conquer. We are Biafra, fighting for our nation. By the name of Jesus, we shall conquer.
The armies of federal Nigeria were slow to get started, but when they did, their eventual success was inevitable, while destruction in their path added to the misery of the war. Many helpless people lost even the little that they had. Many children, orphaned and left to starve, were taken to emergency centers, usually the Christian mission stations, where there was almost nothing for them to eat. After 30 months of war, victory went to the armies of federal Nigeria, and there followed another 9 years of military rule. A succession of able generals showed that they could be both tolerant and constructive, and they restored the Federation to stability and peace. In 1979, the army withdrew in favor of civilian rule, but democracy didn't last, and military rule was re-established on the 1st of January 1984. Nevertheless, the peace which the army brought to Nigeria has been remarkable for its generosity.
The principle of no victor, no vanquished prevailed, and Nigerians became brothers once again soon after the war. And since then, a deliberate effort has been made on all sides, on all directions, to forget the past and join hands in order to build the future. I think in Nigeria's history, this process of reconciliation is something that every Nigerian ought to be proud of.
The British had administered Nigeria as 3 big regions, which tended to make tribal nationalism worse. After the war was over, Nigeria's rulers wisely redivided this enormous country into many much smaller states, providing a blueprint for continued federal unity. Democracy remains the hope for the future.
In some of the smaller communities in Africa, it may be possible to have a dictatorship or any other form of government because it may be manageable because of the size. But in a big country with a large population and diverse population, there's just no other alternative but democracy.
Since 1980, federal Nigeria has embarked on building a new capital at Abuja in the geographical center of the country, which will be a focal point for the whole federation. The expense is enormous, and there have been costly failures in the building program. But it's a brave attempt to get away from the old conflicts and rivalries and make a fresh start. The great city of Lagos is crammed into a small island on the coast. When Nigeria became a major oil exporting nation, the whole country went on a spending spree, importing from abroad all kinds of goods and materials, from mountains of cement to expensive foreign foods. Most of these goods contributed nothing to development. Nigeria, once a food exporter, now imports food in growing quantities. Once aroused, the appetite for Western imports has to be satisfied. Attempts to limit imports are accompanied by massive smuggling and widespread allegations of bribery and corruption. It's often said that many African countries have become disastrously corrupt, that politicians insist on bribes or contracts will not be signed, that officials demand bribes or agreements will not be met, even that nursing sisters in hospitals expect bribes or nursing services will not be rendered. If much of that may be painfully true, perhaps we should ask why. Is it that Africans are naturally dishonest? The facts of history say no to that. Or is it then that the frailties and temptations associated with corruption have always been promoted by building a get-rich-quick system, such as many African countries have gone in for? To that, the facts of history have always said yes. The cities of Africa have enormous commercial vitality. Lagos suffers such interminable traffic jams that a whole profession of street traders has developed. And these do nothing but ply the queues of paralyzed cars, trying to sell anything they can, from apples to alarm clocks.
You try this one and make it very well. Now, so this one is very good. What price? Which one do you want? So we negotiate the price.
To pay for their imports and to get capital for development, many African countries borrow heavily from the outside world. Africa's debts to foreign countries multiplied 4 times in the single decade of the 1970s. And interest payments on these debts, often at high rates, eat into slender resources. A profound economic crisis envelops even the most advanced African countries. Africans naturally want the consumer goods which richer countries have to sell, and the big firms are only too happy to provide them. All across the continent, while poverty increases, so does the desire for the symbols of progress. As the cost of these imports rises, the value of African exports falls. That is the process which Africans condemn as neo-colonialism.
Chaque année, les prix des matières premières et services des pays du tiers-monde stagnent ou baissent, tandis que les prix des marchandises, les prix des biens et des services européens augmentent. Je vais vous prendre un exemple très précis. L'an dernier, les prix des matières premières africaines ont baissé de 20 à 50%. Je vais vous donner un autre chiffre des spécialistes européens. Il y a 2 ans, l'inflation était au maximum en Europe de 15%. Mais dans les pays du tiers-monde, l'inflation était entre 20 et 300%. C'est là que gît le néocolonialisme.
Africa depends on the export of raw materials. In Tanzania, the main export crop is sisal, a fiber used for rope and twine. Its export price is crucial to the country's economy.
When we were preparing our first 5-year development plan, the price of our sisal was 148 British old pounds before devaluation, 148 pounds per ton. We felt this price was not likely to continue. So we planned on the basis that we might average 95 pounds per ton. It dropped down to less than 70. We can't win.
If the Tanzanians could make rope from their sisal, they'd get a better price for their produce. But this is actually prevented by the rich countries, which impose prohibitive duties on finished imports. The EEC put a 12% tariff on twines and cordage.
What can we do? What really can we do? What can a primary producer do? What do we do with our sisal? Eat it? I mean, what can we do with the sisal? We produce sisal, we have to sell the sisal. If the world market price goes down, what can we do? I mean, really, in a world of vultures, what can you do? I mean, really, the weak have to suffer.
Cocoa is the chief export of several African countries, including Ghana. The EEC put a 27% tariff on chocolate, so it doesn't pay for countries like Ghana to manufacture cocoa into chocolate. They have to sell it raw. Yet the price of raw cocoa sometimes falls, catastrophically.
There was a time when you used to give us about 3,500 pounds for a ton of cocoa. Today, you're giving us something around the region of 1,000 pounds. So we're forced to have to slave some more, producing this cocoa, the gold, to bring over to you. Meanwhile, your goods, the prices of your goods have just risen and gone up and up and up. Your manufactured goods that you're passing on to us, which you've cultured us, not only into needing, but into wanting.
If Africans can't win this trade war, perhaps they can earn precious foreign exchange by turning themselves into a tourist spectacle. Over the past 20 years, many African governments have attracted tourists to come and stare at the wildlife in one form or another. Countries like Kenya and Tanzania have turned vast regions into game parks. It's right to conserve these splendid animals, but Africa can't live as a zoo, and competition for land grows fiercer with every year that passes. The cattle of the wide plains of the Sahel, just south of the Sahara Desert, an area 2/3 the size of the United States, have always been the livelihood of many pastoral peoples. So long as wet season rains fall, these dry lands can supply enough grass to see cattle through the dry season. But when the rains fail, disaster quickly threatens. Then the efforts of the pastoralists to keep their cattle alive can only make matters worse. Every year, Africa is losing more than 6 million acres of woodland, partly from a desperate attempt, as here, to provide forage for hungry cattle. When the trees disappear, the water table falls and the soils turn to dust. Here, next year, there will be nothing to eat. Ambitious plans to make grassland farming more productive by building big grain stores or importing expensive machinery have foundered for lack of money to support them or because they don't fit into the life and customs of the pastoralists. The worst drought in living memory hit the Sahel countries in the 1970s, and with it came disaster. Since then, the drought has returned and has now spread far to the south, where productive lands are turning into a dust bowl. Human as well as natural causes lie behind this advance of the desert. Reductions in disease brought about a population explosion of people and livestock. Widespread sinking of wells encouraged bigger herds. The fragile balance with nature, once sustained by pastoral peoples, was destroyed. Terrible human suffering followed. Even in the 2 years of 1972-1973, 250,000 people died of starvation. As always, the children suffered worst, for they can't adjust like adults to sudden shortages of food. Even when parents starved to feed their children, the children still died first. Here in Ethiopia, the rains failed in 1974 for a third year in succession. Hundreds of thousands of people fled from their barren pastures and wherever they could flocked to relief centers, which were soon overwhelmed. In the 1980s, once again, ferocious drought returned. Countless people sent generous aid. But for many, the aid is too little and too late. And Band-Aid alone can't reach the roots of the problem. Only a fundamental change in economic relations between rich and poor can do that. And until that change is made, death by famine will surely strike again. In the aftermath of colonial rule, poverty and hunger now threaten to overwhelm the continent. But much of Africa is rich in natural resources, and these could provide enough for everybody. In a number of countries, Africans are beginning to succeed in putting their material and human resources to better use. Here in Mozambique, the gains of independence have inspired a countrywide effort at reconstruction. But there is still another enemy. The Mozambicans had to fight a long war to end Portuguese rule in 1975, but have since had to face a new violence from gangs armed and sent by a sharply hostile South Africa. At this meeting in Tet, the army presents some terrorists captured from gangs which have killed people and sabotaged communications. The principle here is that government should be everybody's business, and the army is very much a people's army. One young bandit tells the assembled people who recruited and paid him and what he was told to do. Violence from South Africa makes progress much more difficult.
Como é que é possível coexistir a opressão e a liberdade? Enquanto existir o apartheid na África do Sul, enquanto existir na África do Sul o governo de minoria racista, não é possível a paz. O sistema ele próprio já é uma ameaça à paz. Só é possível a paz com a queda do apartheid. Democracia na África do Sul.
Colonial Mozambique became desperately poor, barely able to feed its population. Yet as an independent country, it's potentially a land of great wealth, well able to feed many more people. Spreading across 16 degrees of latitude, Mozambique has soils and climate that could grow a very wide range of crops. The great river Zambezi could provide another source of wealth for Mozambique, electric power. Yet this dam at Cahora Bassa wasn't built for the people of Mozambique, but late in colonial times to send power to South Africa. Since independence, the power lines have frequently been sabotaged by South African-backed guerrillas. And despite recent diplomatic maneuvers by South Africa, the attacks have continued. The dam is almost useless to the country that owns it, but it could furnish the driving force for new industries once Mozambique becomes able to develop them. Large quantities of good coal are another of Mozambique's natural assets. This coal mine at Moatize produced little under the ousted colonial regime. But shortly after independence, the new government asked the miners to help in running the mine and got them interested in higher output. At the same time, the new government began putting in modern equipment, including some of the latest machinery from abroad. At Rissano Garcia on the South African frontier, trains still carry Mozambican workers to and from the gold mines of South Africa. Another hangover from colonial times when southern Mozambique was a dependent part of the South African economy. In the old days, the returning miners were often robbed on arrival and deprived of part of their earnings by the Portuguese authorities. Now they can keep their savings, and their gifts and goods are safe from pilfering. They join a meeting organized to welcome them back to their country, and they're invited to play their part in pushing ahead with the revolutionary changes now underway.
Viva Frelimo! Viva! Viva o trabalhador moçambicano unido no estrangeiro! Viva! Viva o trabalhador moçambicano unido no estrangeiro!
The drive for renewal goes on, the struggle continues. And that's the message in the schools as well. A message that calls for social as well as economic reconstruction. In colonial times, this school served the privileged children of Portuguese settlers and a handful of their hangers-on. Only about 1 in every 100 Mozambicans could read or write. The task of teaching a whole generation may be enormous, but however difficult, it's seen as the key to a different future. The teachers are almost as young as the students, and all of them are the children of long and bitter campaigns against a harsh colonial system. As they say and repeat, every classroom is a zone that we have liberated. At least one Mozambican died to liberate each of our classrooms. This new Mozambique has declared itself a non-racial society where discrimination is no longer permitted. And the answer to the legacy of strife and deprivation, as they see it, is to discover how to draw everyone into a drive for self-development.
In the rebuilding of any society, what matters most is the development of its people. But this can be accomplished only when people are in a position to develop themselves, because nobody else in the end is going to be able to do it for them. This here is an agricultural cooperative on the outskirts of Maputo. It was formed just over a year ago by 38 people on land abandoned by a Portuguese settler when independence came. Everything here is a small but growing part of a system known as People's Power, which extends in various ways across the whole country and is aimed at enabling people in community to develop and exercise social control over their own lives and decisions.
These women decided to work as a self-governing cooperative without any men and see if they could make a living by producing vegetables for Maputo City. Because they have the power to take their own decisions, they've been able to overcome many obstacles. They've built a productive enterprise. To old tunes, they sing new songs. For running their own lives is really something new. But the work tradition on which they're drawing is both old and African. The freeing of women from past servitudes is another aspect of a Mozambican revolution which these people see as being and having to be very much their own creation, and their leaders see it in the same way.
Não se importa a revolução, não se transplanta a revolução tem de ter raízes no país. E este sistema popular é o produto da luta de libertação, é o produto do nosso povo, corresponde integralmente ao desejo do povo inteiro moçambicano. Não se transplanta a revolução.
With this revolution of people's power, Africa may well have found the long-term solution to poverty and confusion, for this is the solution of self-development. Here in Zimbabwe, once the settler colony of Rhodesia, it's a question of building on small and very difficult beginnings. The white Rhodesians crammed millions of country Africans, like this family, into dry and infertile tribal trust lands. Tendai Rusanamonzi and his family of 10 lived on this homestead for 12 years. Now he's been allotted new land a few miles away. Tendai and his family had to survive on 2 acres of overworked land, fast turning to desert. The move came just in time.
Ndikubva pano nenzira yekuti panapa takamanikidzana ende zvekare minda yeti ndenge ndinaye pano ndenge ndine maeka matatu. Ndenge ndine maeka matatu zvino mvura yeti ikanaya maeka iwayo abva anyura nemvura. Ivhu rakura rachembera. Ivhu radete. Saka ndakati regai ndiende kuri kubatsirwa wamwe kuti takapuwa minda. Saka ndakabva pano.
Transport for the move was provided by the government as part of a resettlement scheme, which, if successful, could set a pattern for the rest of Zimbabwe as well as for some other African countries. About 2 million Africans in Zimbabwe desperately need new land. But whites still own 40% of the arable acreage and all the best of it. With more capital and experience, the white farmers are more efficient producers. But the land needs of a huge black majority are a powerful hunger. When a little land does become available, it's the start of a journey to a better future. This new settlement at Mayo has been built on what once were 2 enormous white-owned farms. Only a handful of Europeans and their hired workers lived here before. 1,250 African families live here now, perhaps 8,000 people. Each family used to have 1 or 2 acres. Now it has 12 acres. No wonder they're happy. New land means new life. It can also mean new freedoms. Here, the people of the Mayo settlement have agreed among themselves to build for the future. They're building a school for which the government will provide a teacher. And to do this, they call on their own traditions of mutual aid and community work. This is the Africa that really matters. The Africa of the vast majority, finding their own way to the future. Not begging for help, but expecting that their needs and capacities will be recognized.
Our belief is, I think, the belief of every developing country, that the developed world should not isolate itself and hope that its own welfare can be served by preserving us as sources of raw material. We need to develop our industries, we need to develop our skills, and I think there's got to be this greater understanding between developed countries and developing countries. Our development will redound to the benefit of both sides.
Africa moves into the modern world. And even in old Timbuktu, they're playing their own style of rock music. Ordinary Africans aren't dismayed by the challenges of the world today. And this is the Africa that doesn't despair, that can't afford to despair, but goes stubbornly ahead at its own pace, and yet knows when that's useful how to move with the times. So that there are small changes, small advances, even if these still have to go together with a round of chores that's hard enough and certain to continue. And these small advances nonetheless build into the restless dynamic of major changes, of contradictory advances which pose new problems and yet offer new opportunities to new generations and bring new equalities. Throughout their long history, Africans displayed creative energy and power. Today, making their own way again, the energy and power of the past can be renewed. Africa is going to be able to overcome its modern crisis in the measure that it develops from its own roots and draws strength from its own history of skill and enterprise and independent civilization. And as this self-development begins to flower in Africa now, so will the future begin to reflect once more the manifold achievements of the past. These were some of Africa's decisive moments in history. Today, beyond all present miseries, the sense of destiny and purpose begins to be renewed.
O sistema socialista liberta a iniciativa criadora do povo. O povo é que vai resolver.
Our people were free some time ago. That's why you needed chains to get them. Today you don't need chains because of the influence of our minds. You've got us all trapped, but we're breaking free.
Et ce qui nous sauve, c'est notre vitalité. Vous avez l'esprit de méthode et d'organisation. Nous avons l'esprit d'intuition et l'esprit de création.
I think we have made a good start. I do not say that everything is all right, but we are making improvement, satisfactory improvement, and I believe that things will be better in the future.